Hello, everyone. I, Vipanshika, a master's student from Center for Political Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, on behalf of Foundation for Creative Social Research, welcome you all to the second session of our dialogue series titled Nonviolence and Terrorism in 21st Century.
Foundation for Creative Social Research, or FCSR, is an initiative by a group of scholars and activists which aim to evolve a discursive community to bring forth theoretical perspectives from the vantage point of the marginalized. The foundation seeks to promote researchers in imagining new fields of study. It helps in raising funds for this purpose and developing networks of scholars and activists for sharing their intellectual and social concerns. It supports many initiatives by forming working groups to facilitate discussion, research, and publications by members on various themes.
This series focuses on understanding how Gandhi could be relevant in the present century, especially in dealing with the issue of terrorism. It analyzes the alternative possibilities of evolving a non-violent strategy to meet the political ends. All through our dialogue series, we want to question, how would Gandhi respond to terrorism? Or would Gandhi have responded at all? What kind of strategies, lines of thought, and objectives would nonviolent responses encapsulate? How terrorism breaks the harmony between mind, body, and soul? How to unveil the deep-rooted power relations that manipulate societies, organizations, and states to sustain violence in every form? How not to dehumanize, alienate, and demonize those involved overtly or covertly in the entire web of state and non-state terrorism. To discuss further, today we have with us Dr. Mark Juergensmear as our guest speaker.
Our guest speaker is Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Sociology and Interim Director of the Orfalea Center for Global and International Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and William F. Podlich, Distinguished Fellow and Professor of Religious Studies at Claremont McKenna College. He is pioneer in global studies, focusing on global religion, religious violence, conflict resolution, and South Asian religion and politics. He has published more than 300 articles and 30 books, including the recent God at War in 2020, the award-winning Terror in the Mind of God, and his co-edited Handbook of Global Studies. We are grateful to have you here with us, sir.
To moderate the session, we have Dr. Manindranath Thakur, Member, Foundation for Creative Social Research, and Associate Professor at Center for Political Studies, JNU. Dr. Thakur has been persistently working on understanding Gandhi's relevance in contemporary world, and his idea of ethical realism is one of the important articulations that seeks to break the binary and eschew the exclusivity between ethical and realist perspective. We are grateful to Shailaja, who is with us here, who assisted us through this dialogue. Without any further ado, I would request Dr. Thakur, sir, to please present his opening remarks.
Thank you, Vipanshika and Shailaja and Priya, and thank you, Professor Mark Juergensmear, for being with us. I was just mentioning that how we have known each other since last more than 30 years, and through our common friend, Professor Manoranjan Mohanty.
Yes.
And we have been engaging on various issues. But today's biggest question that we have is about Gandhi's perspective on violence and its relevance for contemporary world. And we want to take it head on in the sense that we want to know if Gandhian perspective can help us in resolving the terrorist kind of phenomenon, or it can help us in managing those conflicts which are supposed to be the worst conflicts of the world. And we are aware of your writings. We have read most of your writings on this theme, your article on Gandhi and terrorism, your book, Terror in the Minds of God, or Gandhi's Way. So we have tried to kind of survey your perspective. And what we discovered was very interesting, that you have a very practical model of how to handle this conflict from Gandhian perspective. There are steps that you have suggested. So would you like to tell us about that in 10 minutes time. Then we can have another 3 segments or 3 kinds of questions that we want to ask you.
Yes, I'd be delighted. And how much time do I have for my opening comments?
10 minutes.
Oh, okay. And then will I have a chance to follow up? Because
Yes.
I've prepared, I didn't know how much time, so I prepared more than would fit into 10 minutes, but.
Please go ahead. Please go ahead as you have prepared.
Yeah, well, if you get nervous, you can just interrupt me. But my simple answer to your question is yes. And so therefore we could just sit down and that would be the end of the colloquium. I would have said my speech, but I should explain why I think Gandhi is a sensible response to terrorism. And to do that, I'd like to show some slides. And I think, I don't have screen sharing. Can you enable screen sharing for me? Make me co-host or something like that?
Yes, I'll do that. I've made you the co-host, sir.
Oh, okay. Now I can screen share, which I will do. I want to talk about a Gandhian approach to terrorism and explain just for a second how my interest in this topic, my interest in this topic comes, because it's both personal as well as intellectual. Years ago, when I first came to India, when I was a graduate student, and I came to Punjab University to do research and also to teach, but there was a famine in Bihar. This was in the 1960s. And so I left my post in Chandigarh and I went to Bihar to work with this guy who you might recognize, Jayaprakash Narayan, who I lived with a larger part of a year in Sadakwat Ashram, his headquarters in Patna, and then worked out in the villages in doing a famine relief projects and really learned Gandhian approaches firsthand from JP. He was a remarkable leader and a very practical kind of Gandhian. So then years later, I embarked on a different kind of interest, again related to my experiences of India, but this time in the Punjab, with the development of the uprising in the Punjab during the 1980s, the so-called Khalistan movement led by Sant Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale, although not everybody was in favor of Khalistan, but it was an uprising of young Jat Sikhs who could have been my own students at Punjab University. And so it was not just an intellectual issue. I wanted to know why. I mean, how could these people so young and so full of life and spirit be swept up in what was a tragic adventure, a kind of vision of cosmic war and battle. And then this led to a comparison of the rise of religious violence all over the world. And this latest version of this book, Terror in the Mind of God, the pictures show the American Timothy McVeigh, the Norwegian Anders Breivik, Osama bin Laden, Jewish activist, the Asha Muratu from the Buddhist monk in Myanmar who is goading on this tragic attack on the Rohingya, al-Baghdadi, of course, with ISIS, the leader of the Aum Shinrikyo. And then you might not recognize Maya Kodnani from Gujarat, the 2002 Gujarat, sometimes called riots. It was really not a riot, it was a pogrom against the Muslims in Ahmedabad. And she was actually convicted on terrorism. So we have at least one certified example in India of a woman who is a convicted terrorist. So you're saying, okay, these are really quite different kinds of project. What do the two things have in common? How could you ever put them together? Well, as it turns out, Gandhi himself put them together. And so for that, we go back to 1906, when Gandhi was in South Africa. And he was defending the South African community. He went to London to try to plead on their behalf. He dressed up, he said, more British than the British. He wanted to impress people. He wanted to stay at a good hotel because he was dealing with the British dignitaries. So he wanted to impress them that these were serious people. But while he was there, he also met with a number of expatriate Indian students who were in London. And a good number of them were all involved in a developing a nationalist movement. And one of them, a Punjabi by the name of Dhingra, attacked a British officer, High Commissioner for India, and killed him. And there was a great deal of discussion about whether this kind of terrorism, these kind of assassination plots, was a worthy and acceptable part of a national strategy. So there was a debate, and Gandhi was asked to be on one side of the debate, opposing this kind of strategy. And on the other side was another young Indian who happened to be there at the time, a man by the name of Savarkar. And so in 1906, Gandhi and Savarkar, of course, went on to found the RSS and coined the idea of Hindutva. But at that time, he was defending assassination plots and terrorism as an acceptable form of a political attack on the colonial rule. And Gandhi was adamantly against it. Now, we don't have a record of that debate. I would have loved to have been the fly on the wall to hear it. We didn't have recording devices at that time. But we had something different, because soon after the debate, Gandhi got on a boat going back to South Africa. And on the boat, he started writing. And he must have been full of ideas and thoughts about this debate he had with Savarkar, because it was the longest piece of writing that Gandhi ever did in his whole lifetime. It was the only book-length project that he ever completed. And we know this book is Hind Swaraj, or Indian Home Rule. And this book was probably his side of the argument with Savarkar, because it's all about, to some extent, it's about terrorism, it's about strategy, but it's also about goals and what kind of nation an independent India should be. And Gandhi was really quite adamant that if you want a peaceful government, you have to use peaceful means to get it. If you use violence, you're going to have a violent government. You have to, the means and the ends have to be consistent. And you can't just do one thing and then suddenly say, okay, now we relinquished power based on might. Now we're not going to do that anymore. It doesn't work that way. It never works that way. And so Gandhi, for practical reasons, and his nonviolence was always for very practical reasons. It's never just because he didn't like blood or because he wanted to be nice. That had nothing to do with it. It was a matter of what is effective and what really ultimately makes a difference. And for him, this kind of terrorism was inconsistent with the goals of a free India. So this led, of course, to Satyagraha, first in South Africa, and then he took the movement to India as part of the Indian nationalist struggle, as a movement that adopted techniques of radical change based on a number of devices of power and nonviolent manipulation that didn't involve killing, but were enormously effective. And Ninder said, I then wrote a book about this. There's really a book for classes. I taught a course, and so I didn't have anything for my students I thought really adequately explain Satyagraha. So I tried to do something simple, very straightforward, and anybody could pick up and understand. I'm glad to know that it's not only been used in classrooms, but it's been used in the general public for conflict resolution scenarios and issues such as that. But it attempts to show how Gandhi can be very practical. This manual of Satyagraha that is based on the idea of Gandhi's idea, not just a conflict resolution, but his idea of fighting and what fighting is about. And that's fundamentally a different of perceptions, a different of principles. And in order to fight effectively, you have to know what the other side is fighting for. You have to put yourself in their position to some extent, even terrorists. And he was really quite adamant about Dhingra, for example, the terrorist, that he said he felt sorry for the man. He was led astray. And he felt that he shouldn't be killed. He should certainly be convicted. We did, after all, commit a crime, but given an opportunity to change, to learn that he had been led astray. He was a victim of not of so much of personal malice, but of bad notions, a bad strategy, thinking incorrectly about what was appropriate for a different kind of society. So I have three examples, and I don't know if we have time to talk about them. I could very quickly mention them, and then we could have the discussion, but examples of how this in fact works. And one was Northern Ireland. And Northern Ireland was, after all, a situation where you have two sets of people who occupy the same space, and they both thought they owned it. It's kind of like the Palestinians and the Israelis, isn't it? And it was vicious. It involved terrorism, black-clad people who would nab people in the middle of the night, torture them cruelly, torture them, and then bombs ignited in Belfast and in London. So for years, all of the UK was in a reign of terror, with the battle not just on the IRA side, but also on the Unionist side, on the Protestant side, who could be equally as vicious. And this fellow Ian Paisley, this firebrand preacher, kind of riled up the people, kind of like Wiratu, into defending the faith. But that all came to an end. There was a solution. And the Good Friday Agreement, they ignored Ian Paisley. They ignored the most extreme of either side and tried to deal with people who were interested in forging peace, and came to an agreement that not for people who trusted each other, because the whole framework of the agreement was based on mutual distrust and how to set up a leverage of power that guaranteed a veto from either side, so that no side would contain the full power. No side could lord it over the other and to ostracize the other. It was a very interesting and good model for other parts of the world, including Israel and Palestine and other places where there is similar contention. The other two suggestions, cases that I want to mention is South Africa. Apartheid was a brutal regime, and the fighting against it, even though ostensibly nonviolent, often was brutal as well. And yet at the end, this man, it was just amazing how the leadership of someone who had been in prison for so long, how Mandela could, rise above his own torture and his own cruelty against him, and be this statesman to unite the country. This movie Invictus talks about how he uses rugby as a way of trying to get the white people in South Africa to be a part of a united nation. And this is a scene from the movie. This is actually the real picture of the real Mandela and the real head of the rugby team meeting at the World Rugby match. And Mandela's wearing the outfit of the rugby team, which is a white man's game in South Africa. Soccer is the black man's sport. And Mandela is telling the captain, he says, I want to thank you for everything you've done. And he says, no, Mr. President, I want to thank you for everything you've done. And this is a guy who came from a very racist family, who was very much pro-apartheid, but was transformed the way people can be transformed on these remarkable occasions. And then working with Desmond Tutu for a whole process of reconciliation in which the evils have been done were not swept under the rug, but brought into the light, where people were trying to set on a path of nonviolent reconciliation. And the third example I want to give is one that's very recent for me, and a part of a book that I've just finished on how religious terrorism ends, called When God Stops Fighting. And this is Mindanao in the southern Philippines. And there was a movement for independence, for a Muslim independence in southern Philippines and Mindanao that was for years a guerrilla movement and very violent, just savage in the way it would attack people. It would kill large numbers of townspeople, but also, of course, government armies and government officials with the Philippine government. But things in the last number of years, since actually in the 5 years before the pandemic that I've been studying this movement, it was during this period that there was a remarkable transformation. Not until after some there were savage acts of violence. This little town of Marari that was basically destroyed because one group of the Muslims who were part of the movement, who were associated with ISIS, hunkered down in the middle of the town, and then the Philippine government with American weapons tried to destroy the village. It was one of these, like Mosul and Raqqa in Iraq and Syria, one of these attempts to destroy the town in order to save it. And you can see how colossal the damage was. And because the ISIS people have been just torturous in their own approach to trying to control power. And yet, there was a remarkable transformation. The guy that I'm talking with was the former commander of the Muslim liberation forces. He was the guy who used to lead the guerrilla fight. And here he is now as the co-chair of the Coordinating Committee on the Cessation of Hostilities. They came to a point where they decided they had to seek a different way and a different pattern. And so they established a zone of peace, which is mentioned here within the school in Cotabato City, the main city and central part of Mindanao. And this led to the creation of a whole new autonomous state. And now there is a Bangsamoro state. The very people I talked with as part of my project are now leaders within the movement. They put down their arms, they put down their weapons. They're now working with the government in a situation that is a win-win strategy for both the government as well as for the Mindanao movement. So the point is that Gandhi works, that these attempts to try to develop a win-win strategy work. Not everyone is convinced, not the most extreme of the terrorist leaders can be converted to this way, but many others can, especially if a movement has gone on for some years and futilely. And key to this is something I talk about in my book on When God Stops Fighting, and that's hope. And that's an important element in which the government can take the concerns and the perspective of the militants seriously and offer an alternative way, a way in which at least meets some of their demands, but also gives them a life, gives them an opportunity to see themselves thriving in a situation outside of guerrilla warfare. And that's absolutely essential on both a personal and social level for people to see an alternative, that there is not just a dead end and all they can do is fight. And that's something that governments can do. Often they don't. The problem is that very often the government response to these acts of terrorism is just use more terrorism, to fight fire with fire, to try to use more violence to stop violence. And that never works. That never works. It often just riles up the movement the more. It gets them defensive and they get even more. The only time when the militancy appears to be effective is when a movement is essentially destroyed from within. And this is what I discovered in the Punjab movement in Khalistan. The leader, the police commander Gill, whom I interviewed just shortly before his death, was convinced that he did it, that he was able, his militancy and the police were able to crush the movement and by just having an all-out assault of warfare against the young people. But if you talk with people within the movement, including some of the old leaders like Zafarwal, whom I was able to talk with in Batala, north of Amritsar, you'll see that the movement was already dead. It was already had the internal infighting, the internal loss of faith, the way the villagers had turned against the movement. It essentially had been destroyed within. And there could have been really quite other ways of resolving that conflict that didn't involve the massive killing of young people as it was done in the early 1990s when the movement finally came to an end. My point is that only one of these movements, the three movements that I study in this book, was successful, and that's one in the Philippines in a Gandhian way. The Punjab movement is still in some ways unsettled because it was never really settled. ISIS, even though it was defeated in territory, continues to be very strong, even growing. And when I talk with people in refugee camps near Mosul, even while I was talking, I would hear stories about recruiting going on in the refugee camps, the movement building back up again among disaffected people who saw that the government wasn't doing anything to help repair the city, to get them back, get their lives going again. And in that kind of desperation, people have to have a sense of alternative. They have to have some hope for a future. You have to give what Gandhi gave in Satyagraha, that alternative, a kind of a different outcome that people on both sides can embrace. And without that, you have a great deal of futility, because ultimately the Gandhian approach is one that is a part of all aspects of life and relates to all dimensions of life. It's not just a method of fighting, it is in fact a way of life. So I probably took longer than you wanted me to take, but I did want to make these points and give these examples before we have a chance for discussion.
Oh, this was great. I think you just summarized the entire spectrum of things that we have been doing. I think there are many questions that we have, but let me go one by one. One question that I think is there in our mind is more about the theory of nonviolence. Whether it is a pragmatic idea, as you have mentioned in some of in your books and articles at some places, that Gandhi was what you called tough-minded realist, or is it a kind of a value and not a strategy? That is the ethics of Gandhi, which is very important. His appeal to higher self is more important, or its value as a strategy. I think I'll bring Priya at this moment. She has been talking about this issue a lot. Priya, please.
Hello, sir. Thank you for the presentation. I think it was really thought-provoking, and now I have more questions to ask now. I had listed some, but now I have more. So one of the questions is, it pertains to this entire, theoretical realm where we see two schools of thought, be it pacifist or the pragmatist. So you consider Gandhi as a tough-minded realist and not a saint. Do you think that in the contemporary times, this has given an upper hand to the pragmatic nonviolence? And that gives priority to treating nonviolence as a strategy, while the pacifists are not being given much recognition in the entire arena of conflict transformation. And do you think that having a pragmatic lens alone can really help, us in conflict? Yes, it can help us in conflict resolution, that I agree to. And but don't you think that for conflict transformation, we need to take both these schools together? I mean, when we see non-violence as a strategy, I think that it is limited to resolving the conflict per se, and actually the kind of as you said also, that these conflicts, what happens is that they may fizzle out for some time, but then they come back because of the fact that there is a loss of that attachment to values, loss of faith, as you said, so which is required to make a foundation for the entire that hope. And I think for that, pacifist nonviolence is also very important. So by pacifist nonviolence, I do not mean that there is a sort of passive nonviolence. It is also active in some way, if we consider it from the lens of conflict transformation. Do you think that?
Yeah, the simple answer is yes. I mean, both dimensions that you talk about are essential. And the word nonviolence really doesn't mean much, in the sense that it's just not violent. So it can mean all kinds of things. And so, I prefer to talk about Satyagraha, because if you talk about Satyagraha, then you're talking about a very rich and much more complete sense of a strategy, and a view of conflict and a view of conflict resolution that involves both things you're talking about, certainly ethics, but also a pragmatic strategy for change. Because essentially, before it's a view of conflict resolution, it's a view of conflict. and that is, why are people at each other's throats? And Gandhi's answer is rather simple. It's not just who's fighting or how they're fighting. It's what they're fighting for. And so any contest is really a fight over values. And it's a fight over who's ultimately right, who is closer to the truth. The problem is that none of us really have the truth. We're imperfect human beings. And as pompous as we may be because of our, I don't know, religious affiliations or moral values or whatever, and we think, oh, we're right. Well, we're not. I mean, Gandhi put it very simply, everyone has their own angle of vision on truth. So it may be a skewed one. Surely, you know, a lot of the political actors I see around the world today, I think have a very sad and skewed notion of truth. But they have something within that perspective that is worth appreciating. If nothing more than simply the dignity of themselves, their own dignity as persons and their own desire to try to protect and defend themselves and their culture. When Ajahn Varatu, the Buddhist monk in Myanmar, when I talked with him, he had just been on the cover of Time magazine as the Buddhist face of terror. So I was in Yangon and then went up to Mandalay to meet with him in his monastery. And the first thing he said is, "Do I look like a terrorist?" And he kind of giggled. And I felt like saying, "Well, yeah, you look like all the terrorists I've talked with, you know, which is say like anybody else." And he said, "You know, we Buddhists are nonviolent." And I said, "Yes, I understand that." And he kept on saying that. "Yes, I understand that." So I was saying to myself, how do I get around this and get him to talk about his own justification for all of these things? I said, but of course, Buddhists are nonviolent, but they have to defend themselves sometimes, don't they? And he said, yes. You have to defend. I said, well, from whom? They said, from those enemies of Buddhism, those people who are trying to attack Buddhism. And I said, who are those? And they said, those enemies. I said, who are those enemies? They said, the Muslims. They're the ones who are trying to get us. We have to stop them before they get us. Well, that's absurd, of course. I mean, the Muslim minority in Myanmar is just tiny and certainly not armed in any kind of significant way to do damage to Buddhist culture. And yet I appreciate, and I can understand, at least to some extent, the truthful notion of his fear and his sense of losing self and losing culture really in an era of globalization, because he said he watched international news all the time. Everybody should watch international news. And I said, why? He said, well, look, I'll just show you the map. He said that here's Burmese Buddhism. And he talked about it as if it was a different kind of religion. and here's Islam, this huge wash of red. And it's about to engulf the world. So he had a kind of global vision. It was a skewed one, and one that in his mind terrified him, because he saw, you know, the vanishing of his cultural identity. But something rang a bell with me, because it's so similar in different ways to people in the United States who were attacking the Capitol on January 6th and who felt that white Protestant heterosexual males are losing their dominance in American society, and they're losing their privilege, and you know, their culture is in peril because of the rise of multiculturalism in the United States, which I think is wonderful, you know, because I love being part of a global society, and you know, I'm now in Southern California, which is a global, you know, really a world city, but not everybody feels that way. I understand the defensiveness. So the point I'm making is that you begin with the theory of conflict, that takes seriously the perspectives, the angles of vision that everyone has on the truth. And then you try to make sense of what aspect of these are worth admiring, what aspect of these are, in Gandhi's terms, satya, or truthful. And of course, satya is a wonderful word because it's based on sat, to is, what reality, what really is, And so, and he was convinced that there is a truthful reality. We just don't know what it is. And that's why I like fighting, by the way, because one of the what you get out of fighting is you get to see somebody else's perspective, which you would never know before. You just go on with life thinking your perspective was the only one in the world. It's only when you run into somebody who's radically different than you, has a completely different perspective on life, that you suddenly have to say, whoa, what is this about? Now you can be very defensive and say they're nuts, I'm not listening to them. And unfortunately, we often do that. Or what Gandhi would like us to do is to say, they're in trouble about something, we should understand what it is. And try to figure out if it's something, at least aspects of it, not everything, of course, but at least aspects of it that can be fit into a larger vision of truth. There's such a goal. And so that's an ethical exercise, but it's also a very practical one because it's a strategy for change that then involves, various techniques that try to encourage recalcitrant people on the other side to take seriously a notion of truth that you have created, that you think it incorporates some of their concerns. And with luck, maybe they will agree, and maybe you'll be able to move beyond that. Maybe not. But it seems to me that's the Gandhian project, which in a way never ends because we're always in conflict with somebody and something. This is a lifestyle as much as it is a technique. So that's why I agree with you in saying it's not just a strategy, it's more than that. But that's why I'm more comfortable talking about satyagraha, because then you have the full understanding of how conflict resolution fits into a theory of conflict, in a larger sense, fits into a theory of life. That simply the term nonviolent strategy or passive resistance doesn't do, which is why Gandhi never liked those terms. That's why he had a contest to say, come on, let's invent a term that is, really fits what we're doing. And that's when satyagraha emerged as a term that fit, this grasping on truth, holding firm to truth. It's a wonderful idea.
Yes, I think Satyagraha Gandhi treated as an invitation for dialogue.
Yeah, exactly.
And there were two major philosophical backgrounds on which this term probably emerged in that movement. One was Jain philosophy of Anekantvad, which says that you may be correct, you also may be correct. So there is not one version of truth. There could be many versions of truth. And Gandhi transformed that into a technique of dialogue, and which probably also resembles with another technique of dialogue in India, which comes from Nyaya philosophy, where there are three kinds of dialogues. One is debating to know, other is debating to win, and third is debating to destroy the debate. That is called Vad, Vivad, and Vitanda. So Gandhi probably was more close to what you call Vad, means you are debating to know and debating to know the other's perspective. And so you create a Purvapaksh and an Uttarpaksh, and finally you engage in a debate and arrive on a better truth. So you think that that is the kind of debate or satyagraha oblique debate could resolve a lot of crises, a lot of conflicts in India.
Yeah, and I think what you said is very important, that is to move to that higher stage, because otherwise it could be interpreted as simply relativism. Everybody's right. Everybody has an angle of truth. They're all right. And Gandhi never believed that. It wasn't a matter. I mean, some people have a perspective that's like 90% rotten. And, you know, when he came to the conclusion that the best place for British in India was out of India, you know, they just didn't have a place in it. So their position really had no place, although he appreciated the aspects of British civilization, which were a gift to emerging India. He appreciated administrative aspects and roads and so forth, and the judicial system, but British as people had no place there. And I think it's important for us to understand that that's where ahimsa comes in for Gandhi. Nonviolence comes in as a litmus test, as he put it, for whether you're on the right track of trying to create a compromise, a kind of Gandhian compromise out of this debate. Because just to debate and just to accept that there are truthful sides on both sides is only one step. The next step is then to try to build on that, to create a new platform, a truthful solution in which is a large enough room for everybody to take part.
Then I would like to bring Vipanchika in now, who has a question about the multiple histories and multiple truth claims. So, for instance, he talks about Arab-Israel conflict. And do you think that that could be resolved in this dialogical way? Vipanchika, please, what is your...
So I really was intrigued about your point about the multidimensionality of truth, for the lack of better phrase. It's good. I mean, it's a way forward to have the conflict resolution done. However, in cases like Israel and Palestine, where there is a clear power imbalance, where we know how the world countries have been, blindly supporting certain, the powerful countries in the world, lending their support to Israel has just changed things, and it's probably one of the reasons why it's the longest stalemate that we've been seeing in the world. So in those cases, how do we really come about, how do we really enter this first step of conflict resolution? Is there a way out, since you've been working on field? So I just wonder how we can really go about.
Certainly.
If one party is very powerful, then will that party come on the negotiation table for Satyagraha?
You mean like in South Africa, when the apartheid regime had all of the political, military, economic power against the Black Africans, that kind of case? Well, look what happened in South Africa. And the point is, it happened in part because of kind of international moral suasion. And South Africa increasingly was aware that it was becoming a kind of international pariah that did affect it economically. And this could also happen in the case of Israel. Be surprised what changes could come about simply through changes of leadership. We've already seen some of that with Netanyahu stepping down and now Biden replacing Trump, and but also changes in the global Israeli community, global Jewish community, because I'm speaking now about Jews in America, which are about the same number, if not more, than the number of Jews in Israel. And in general, and especially the younger generation of Jews in the United States, want very much for there to be a solution with Palestine, and who feel very much that the Palestinians have been impressed and they're embarrassed by the stance of Israel, particularly under Netanyahu. So you have the basis of that kind of moral suasion, which Gandhi had, after all, internationally against the British, and which the Black South Africans had against the apartheid regime in South Africa. And then I think you also have some very smart people on both sides who are trying to find a way out. I've been working in the last couple of years with a movement that's growing in the United States and also in Israel and also in Palestine for an Israeli-Palestinian Confederation. And the idea is to create a kind of additional governmental structure, kind of like the EU in Europe, It wouldn't replace the Palestinian Authority, it wouldn't replace the Israel government, but it would create a kind of overarching governmental structure to deal with issues that are common to both Israelis and Palestinians. Water rights, for example, COVID, the pandemic, issues of trade. You can just think of a whole host of things that they have very much in common, and which would be facilitated if there was some sort of device to help facilitate it, and could kind of gradually, if not sooner, erase the boundaries between two areas of the country. It wouldn't immediately create a one nation solution. It could lead to a two nation solution. But it would certainly could be in a very important transition, because then it would provide a forum, a representative forum, and the way this confederation has been set up would give, it was designed in part like the Good Friday Agreement in Ireland. And remember, I said this is a remarkably similar kind of situation than to Israel and Palestine, where two groups of people both inhabit the same piece of land. And what they set up was a way of protecting both sides who didn't trust each other, to make sure they would have veto power over the other. And that's what this Confederacy government does also. So it may be a cumbersome political thing, because both the Palestinians and the Israeli side has to agree, because they could either one could veto the other, any bill that they didn't like. So anything that they create has to be something that everybody accepts. I mean, this is really a kind of legislative Gandhianism, creating a mechanism that makes it possible for people through legislation to find avenues of cooperation that both sides agree upon. I think it's brilliant. I'm amazed now at the kind of traction it's taken. When I first, well, it's been more than 5 years that I've been meeting with Joseph Abasar, the guy in Los Angeles who's been full-time. He was originally a lawyer in Israel, and his full-time occupation is trying to develop this movement. And now I've been amazed with the number of high-ranking Israeli and Palestinian officials now who have taken part in. He has these simulation exercises. You pretend like you're part of the parliament, just to let people know what it would be like if Israel and Palestine had a joint parliament. And I've been involved in a number of these, and it's really, what I'm saying is there are waves of thinking about moving ahead that can be very productive, and that sooner or later, it seems to me that it'll be something in the past. And I say that with confidence, because almost all intractable problems have been a thing of the past. We thought apartheid in South Africa would be there forever. Why would the white South Africans ever leave? They just assumed they were going to be massacred as soon as the blacks took over. And that's why Mandela was so careful in trying to assure them that they would be secure within he would not treat them the way they treated him. And what a magnanimous gesture, what a gracious gesture, but what a smart one, as a statesman, because he put the unity of the country above his own sense of pride and resentment, which normal people, I certainly would have if I had been imprisoned. I went to the island of South Africa where he was imprisoned for so many years, and I saw the cell that he was in. I just said, oh my goodness, to have endured that for so long and then to come out and to have this kind of spirit of reconciliation, it's just, to me, almost saintly. Just, to my mind, is one of the great figures of modern political history. But the point is, these things happen. When I was I was younger, I thought the Cold War would exist forever. I thought that forever, the United States, the capitalist countries would be against those godless commies. That's what I was raised on. We thought they were going to come over the hills just the next morning. We had duck and cover. We were afraid that they were going to come and attack us. We're right in our schoolyard. And That didn't happen, but more importantly, the Berlin Wall came down, and then suddenly we were trading with those godless commies, and they were dealing with them. And relations are not perfect between the United States and Russia and China, but they're certainly not like the Cold War. It's not a war, for one thing. So what I'm saying is wars end, and these kind of intractable conflicts do come to an end. So the question is how and how soon, and what can be done to facilitate their transformation.
Yeah, there's another minor question related to this. Priya Vipanchika has in mind about your take on what do we need to do to facilitate this kind of dialogue, whether it is forgiveness or forgetting. What should be the condition for initiation of dialogue? Their commitment to certain larger ethical, philosophical principle of forgiveness, or just thinking of forgetting everything that has happened. Vipanchika, would you like to say something more on this?
Yeah, I think what Sir just told, like what Mark Sir said, was very reassuring, because I as a student also feel very hopeless when I look at these conflicts and think that this is not going to end anytime soon. But I think looking at these examples, I think, yeah, that was very very reassuring, I must say. But again, when you brought about the point about South Africa, and obviously the reason why there is an end to this was, like you said, reconciliation, and which is what actually drives me to study about prisons as well. Because in your presentation too, when you were talking about Punjab, you said that it isn't settled yet because it was never given a chance to settle. So the state too simply throws the criminals into the prisons, confines them into something just because they did something, right? So there's no chance for dialogue. There's no way that we are resolving these things. So, like, how about we give a chance to settle these things? And in that case, I was reading your book, Gandhi's Way, Handbook of Conflict Resolution. And the idea that I got from it is mostly about forgiveness. However, I also read a review of your book by a student, and where the person, I think his name is Daryl Cole, he was equating your idea of forgiveness to something called as a no fault principle, which is used in current day conflict resolution, which means basically to forget the crimes committed by people on both sides. But what I feel is perhaps forgetting is not something that anybody can do. What we can do is just forgive. I just wanted to understand what did you mean, and is the reviewer really right in saying that it is forgetting and not forgiving?
Oh, well, there can be a cheap forgiveness, which is basically, as you say, forgetting and just kind of saying, okay, well, it's over and done with. And that never really resolves anything. And the expensive form of forgiveness is the kind of thing that Bishop Tutu was trying to create with the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in South Africa, where all the pain and all the wounds are laid bare for people to know about and to understand. And then, what to do about it? Well, you can punish people, and there are occasions when punishment is appropriate. But you can also say, well, instead of punishment, now that you know, and now we know, it's open. Now let's try to go on with life. And that's difficult, troublesome, but it's a form of appropriating the pain of the past into the present that I think is a deeper forgiveness, and that's I think that's an appropriate approach. Where in that book did people think that I said that we should have forgetfulness? Or I'm trying to figure out where that came from. When you write a book, you never know what people are going to make out of it. And so I'm a little surprised. I don't remember even talking about that, but I'll accept your word that there was something there that triggers somebody's mind that I said something like that. You know, with the Terror in the Mind of God, I got critical reviews for saying that religion caused violence. I said, what? And they said, well, you use the term religious violence. I said, well, yeah, I mean, violence related in some way to religion. I mean, when you talk about religious music, you don't think religion causes music, right? If you talk about religious art, you don't think religion causes. Religious violence is something, you know, no, I don't think religion causes violence, but it can be related to it in sometimes awful ways. And you know, it's that relationship that's worth understanding. So anyway, I think whatever they thought I said, I didn't mean to say, at least in that way.
No, I'm sure. I think it's more complex than forgetfulness. I think it's kind of
A
relationship.
deep forgiveness that involves reconciliation in the way that Bishop Tutu was trying to do. I think that, you know, my wife works on ethnic, she's in the field of ethnic studies, and she works on ethnic communities in Asian, particularly Asian communities in the United States, including her own Chinese community, but also other Asian communities, including Cambodians. And so there are these Cambodian gangs in Southern California, and she traces that in part because of the unresolved conflicts in Cambodia. They never had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Cambodia. And some of the people who were associated with Pol Pot's regime then later on became figures in the government in a kind of forgetfulness that you're talking about. It was very painful because it meant that people who knew all of this just couldn't take them seriously. So there was just a terrible breakdown in confidence and trust. And this has been passed on to a new generation of young people who are not even in Cambodia. They're Cambodians, but in the United States. And she thinks that this is directly related to the lack of a real resolution in a Gandhian sense of taking seriously conflict and trying to understand it instead of just glossing over it the way it was done in Cambodia. So no, glossing over, I think, is just the antithesis of a Gandhian approach.
Absolutely. I think crossing over is the normal thing that the modern state is doing also, mostly. In India also, I think the Gujarat violence, we have just crossed over. We have not really gone for social healing, the kind of woundedness that it has created. We have not tried to engage with that trauma, the psychological crisis that people have faced. I think I'll now would like to get into another kind of question, that is, what is the reason for this kind of violence, and how do you differentiate between different kinds of violence? And one of the questions that I think is going to be difficult to answer is the crisis created by modernity, and particularly the hypermodernity, that is the crisis of the self. And Priya has this question, because Gandhi is a critique of modernity also. And I'd like to know your position. Priya, would you like to articulate the question properly?
Yeah, some of that is begins in Hinswabraj, in fact.
Yeah. Priya? Yeah.
So, yeah, hello. Yeah. So, sir, I had one of the questions which was related to real conflict resolution also. And it comes from this crisis of modernity. It is related to that. That, you have also mentioned, and we know that Gandhi's methods were more than a way of confronting an enemy. They were dealing with the conflict itself. But I mean, I'm asking this from the state's perspective also, how the conflicts are being resolved from that perspective, that in today's time where terrorism is associated with particular organizations, and the modus operandi of resolving the conflict begins with targeting that particular organization, which takes responsibility of the terrorist activity. How do you think Gandhi's methods of going beyond the enemy could be operationalized in such a scenario?
Well, I'm not sure that the form of organization really makes that much difference in that people are always are organized and particularly in their opposition, and that's one deals with the whole movement, not just with individuals, but within the movement. Always you're dealing with individuals and the angles of vision they bring with them. In my, I just told you I've been working on this project on how terrorist movements end, and one of the projects is on ISIS. And so I've been talking with people who are supporters of ISIS, both kind of marginally, who are, Sunni Arabs who felt primarily that the Shia were taking over their country and depriving them, and their support of ISIS was primarily for reasons of social identity. They want to support the Sunni Arabs, but also some, particularly the ones I talked with in prison, who had been militants with ISIS directly. They were more directly connected with the ideological and kind of apocalyptic millenarian vision of ISIS, that this was, the world is coming to an end, and the Shia are really evil demigods. They're not just our social enemies, but they are, satanic beings, and therefore you can kill them without any kind of sense of guilt. So these are all people for whom their vision, their angle of the truth is a shared one, is a part of a movement, and buttressed by it, informed by it. The same is true of the fighters, the QAnon. That's another group I'm interested in the United States. There's the people who were involved in January 6th, just the attack on the US Capitol earlier, not earlier this year. It's been a full year ago. Time flies. Been a full year ago in the United States. And these people also were just so convinced that they were right, that Trump, so convinced that despite everything we know, which reason tells us Trump really had won the election. Moreover, he had to win the election because he was regarded as a savior figure. He was going to come and rescue the world from this pedophile ring that was really secretly in control of the Capitol. I mean, these are crazy ideas, and some of them are really far out, that Democrat politicians, feed on the blood of children, and they, try to kidnap children in order to drink their blood. I mean, this is crazy, but nonetheless, they have a shared media outlet, not just Fox News, but also radio programs. And so they live in a kind of media bubble of information. And then people with whom they're associated, they create a fairly tight kind of net of this constructed worldview. And so I think this is exactly what you're talking about. How do you penetrate that? Because it is often a difficult thing to penetrate. And same is true with ISIS, these people who we're talking about. And in my book, I talk about several things that can happen to transform the situation. And one is internal. That is when the movement itself begins to fall apart, when they begin to, they're infighting and they see their leaders as corrupt, as really being greedy, and they get fights with each other, and there are power struggles, which there is in every movement. And they get, kind of a number of people, including some of the most militants who still believed in the caliphate, who believed in this vision, apocalyptic vision. But they said that ISIS was, as an organization was worthless. They said because they were just fighting among each other, and they really were bitter about the leadership and what was going on within it. And the other thing is what we do and how we approach it from the outside. And this is what I tell people who are concerned about their own relatives who may be supporters of QAnon. People in my own extended family are supporters of have this kind of crazy vision. And a lot of people in my family just don't want to talk with them because they think they're nuts. And I talk with them, but I don't argue with them. Because there's no point in arguing with them. What I do is try to understand them and to try to show that I'm concerned about them, to let them know I love them, and to talk about things that we have in common that are not related to politics or something else. food or mutual friends or children, or there's so many things in life that we have in common that have nothing to do with politics. To kind of reaffirm a normal view of the world, an alternative view of the world, and make it clear that I'm not an enemy. I'm not one of those outsiders. I am somebody whom they can talk with and they can trust. And often, at least in time, they do. They're able to talk with me and they share some of their own misgivings about the movement that they're part of. And I don't try to move too quickly and say, yeah, you're on the right road. I say, I can understand how you feel that way. And I think that's both on an individual level, but also on a collective level, the way you deal with these movements that are difficult to penetrate, because after all, there is satya, there is truth, there is a shared truth that all of us share. And it's important to bring that into the picture and for people to be reminded of that, and that there is, beyond these bubbles, there is a common humanity.
Yes, but do you think that this intervention by a new technology, or the relationship between communities and also relationship between individual and individual, is now more mediated by technology? As a consequence, the kind of approach that you are suggesting, or the kind of idea that Gandhi was having to appeal to feeling, may be becoming more difficult now.
Yeah, I wrote a short piece once on the emergence of the digital self, and three problems with the digital self. And one is the illusion of knowledge that you have, with Google and all this information at your fingertips. You have a kind of empowered with the sense of knowledge, and you see it with this rejection, at least in the United States, of COVID vaccine by people who say, "Oh, I've done my own research." Well, what kind of research have they done? Are they immunologists in a laboratory? No. What they've done is they've Googled, COVID, and they've found information, and they've seen some videos on YouTube, and they've heard about this from some other person who claims to be a doctor, and it kind of reinforces their vision. So there's the illusion of knowledge, and then the second is the illusion of power. That kind of with this knowledge, they feel that then they don't have to listen to experts like me. I've been astounded how much people in our business, and then they're trivialized because now other people think, oh well, they have as much knowledge as we do. They don't need to listen to these so-called experts, but they also don't need to listen to the authorities. And I see this in religion, that the religious authorities increasingly sidelined with new movements. I've seen this in the Protestant church in the United States. It's just plummeted, and it's the traditional hierarchical church organization with the emergence of new independent evangelical communities that don't have this kind of power center. And you see it in every other aspect of life where, including the insurgency movement on the Capitol, where people feel that they have the right. They're empowered. They can actually assault the Capitol. They can be a part of an insurgency. It's an amazing thing. But this is, I think, the second dimension of the digital self. And the third is the illusion of community. The feeling that, oh, well, we're not alone, that there is a larger group behind us. Andras Breivik, the guy who attacked those youth in Oslo at the youth camp and killed all those poor people, sent out this message on Twitter and his Facebook account to thousands of people. And he was under the illusion that these thousands of people who followed him on Twitter and Facebook are part of a community, Well, we know how illusory that is. Reminds me of a cartoon in New Yorker magazine that showed it was a funeral, and the casket was there. Then there were like just 2 or 3 people in the audience, and in the back, the wife was whispering to the funeral director. He said, "You know, he had over 1,000 friends on Facebook. I thought there would be a larger crowd." Well, our friends on Facebook aren't really friends, you know, and those people who follow us on Twitter don't really follow us. So we have the illusion of community.
I think these 3 kinds of illusions, very nicely you have articulated, wonderful. Illusion of knowledge, and illusion of power, and illusion of community. I think these 3 illusions could create a major crisis of the self.
Exactly.
That might further the identity crisis that we face. And then we start looking for our identity in the community, and going back to the community, and then having aggressive identity politics would be a kind of resort to this kind of crisis that we are facing. In that situation, do you think this kind of dialogue that you are thinking of, or the Gandhian model of negotiation, would be difficult to carry on?
Well, yeah, I mean, it creates a different kind of arena for dialogue and discussion, but nothing's impossible. It just seems, we have to approach it somewhat differently. And, you know, to begin with, to try to find some way to break up this siloed information. And already to some extent, there now regulations are developing against Twitter and Facebook to not allow the kind of misinformation that so easily has been a currency. And I think it's a problem for democratic societies because we believe in freedom of speech, and that's a good thing. And yet in the current kind of media atmosphere where it's so easy to block off freedom of speech by simply containing or imprisoning within a shell one particular kind of thought, there has to be, I think, legislative devices to try to break this open. I mean, that would be one approach to it. And then on an individual level, of course, you do what I do with my extended relatives, but that's a one-to-one kind of approach where how do you approach people who are in one of these bubbles? Well, you don't play their game. You don't try to argue with them. You try to remind them that there's a larger world. But I admit it's a new challenge. It's a different kind of challenge.
Yeah, thank you. I think Priya has another concern, that is, how could we replace the violence, what Professor Mohanty calls revolutionary violence, by Gandhian, say, satyagraha? Is it possible? I mean, I'm talking, of course, of Naxal movement, and Priya would like to make some more point on this. She has done her MPhil on this point. Yeah. Yes, Priya?
Yes, sir. So my take is that it is true that I think that revolutionary violence as well as Gandhi's way of nonviolence both aim at transformation. But how to convey this significance, the real significance of, Gandhian way of struggle to larger, to those who adhere to the path of revolutionary violence, because they think that it would lead to, a very substantive transformation and achieving of their goals, definitely. So how do we do that?
Yeah, because they also look at violence more as structural violence produced by the state. So will the modern state, this modern capitalist state, which I think is emerging more as techno-authoritarian state, would concede to any non-violent, any satyagraha, given the kind of interest of the capital and global capital involved in that? Do you think there is a possibility for that kind of transition, or the new transition, or any next transition in political economy will demand certain kind of violence against the state.
Do you think it would capitulate to any kind of violent insurrection? I think the likelihood is equally as dismal. If you're dealing with kind of a corporate capitalism that's in league with governmental structures, it's unlikely that any kind of insurrection, certainly a violent one, would quickly succeed. So I think, in fact, probably the only kind of insurrection that might succeed is one that's much more clever and is designed to undercut and not play that game of force versus force. There was a cartoon in the South African Rand Daily Mail when Gandhi was first organizing his satyagraha movements in South Africa. It showed a government tank, and that a man was just standing in front of the tank, just resolute with his arms crossed. And the tank driver would say, "Come on, you shoot first. Play the game the way you're supposed to." Well, if you play the game the way you're supposed to, then he's going to be shot dead. But Gandhi, I think wisely, he said, "Why play that game? There are different games to play that are much more clever and much more effective." And Gandhi was also a revolutionary. Remember, he was the line between revolutionary violence and non-revolutionary violence is very close because they're both revolutionary. Now you're talking about what works in what situations. So what Gandhi did, of course, was to organize. And he organized satyagrahis into disciplined fighters. And he tried to have training that would be, in his mind, as effective as the training of fighters. He had great respect for armies, had great respect for soldiers. I mean, he had, in fact, been in the Boer War. He had served in World War I in a nursing corps. He knew what fighters were like, and he knew what the discipline was like in order to be able to fight. And he wanted to have the same kind of discipline, the same kind of training for people who were willing to fight in a collaborative way through these strategies that were essentially nonviolent, but were also, they weren't just sitting around, they were doing something. They were actively engaging with the opposition in a way that could be far more effective. So I think the difference between revolutionary violence and nonviolence, at least in the Gandhian sense, remember, I don't like the term nonviolence because I'm not sure what it means, but certainly revolutionary satyagraha and revolutionary violence. And again, I don't know what kind of violence you're talking about because there are different kinds of violence, but if you're talking about revolutionaries, then whether they use techniques that are violent or nonviolent really is a matter of what works and what is consistent with the goal, as Gandhi argued with Savarkar, 1906 in London. It's what do you want to achieve, and how are your methods going to affect your outcome?
Yes, I think what I had in mind was the Naxal violence and the violence to reframe the property regime and the entire social relationship, which is in India going on since last many decades, and we don't know where are we reaching. So state is becoming much more authoritarian and uses, now it is actually saying that they're very dangerous, very difficult to work.
Well, so that's the problem with violent strategies. It can be easily dismissed and easily controlled. It doesn't mean that the aims and the goals of the Naxalites are any less important. But if you can then accept that they have a legitimate cause and you want to favor it, how can you creatively think of ways to promote that cause that doesn't automatically get them killed or get them rounded up and put in prison, where they're not really doing anybody any good? So again, we're talking about, we're not quarreling over whether the causes are just or good. We're just talking about how they can be, how can they be the Kisan movement just kind of finished. Who knows whether it's really finished, but it was the largest protest movement in history. It was extraordinary, the number of people who were involved and the persistence. And particularly in Delhi, people are very aware of the power of this movement and its ability to stop roads and stop access to the city and to persist despite just the most difficult decision and situations and the cold. Hundreds of these protesters died because of the conditions. I don't think they killed anybody. It was always a nonviolent protest. But ultimately, Modi caved, and the three critical laws were rescinded. Now you can say, he was looking at the elections, and that's why. Yes, right. But it's going to affect the elections largely because of the Kisan movement. I mean, that had a huge effect on how the elections were going to turn. So now you could say, well, who knows? Maybe next year you could come back with a different attempt to try to support agribusiness that will be just as onerous to the traditional family farms in the Punjab and UP and other places that are involved in the Kisan movement. And that may be true, but that could have been true regardless of the approach. All I'm saying is that this is example of a movement that, at least temporarily, seems to have been extraordinarily effective and has made its mark in a way that other movements, more violent, unfortunately have not.
Yeah, I think Kisan movement is a good example in recent times. The adequacy of Gandhian technique, and despite all provocation by the state, they did not really buzz to that, and they maintained the Gandhian satyagraha kind of model, and it has worked. So that is a great thing. Thank you. So any other question that you people have, we can have one more question from each one of you, and then we can wind up the discussion for today.
Okay.
Panchika?
Yeah. While we are on this point about the method, I was wondering if you can clarify about the concept that you have given, sir, which is called detentive coercion, which you've given in your book, Terror in the Mind of God, wherein you said it's basically the idea to use violence in order to resist larger violence from occurring. But, when we look at this concept of detentive coercion at a micro level, for example, let's say in India, where we have laws like these, preventive detention laws, wherein the state applies force and imprisons students, assuming that they may cause disorder in the society. Otherwise, also, for example, Israel also gains legitimation from its people and also the world countries because it can show at the violence that is caused by Palestinians, a group of it, which is Hamas, and then justify it to cause even more larger damage and also do a lot of damage to innocent Palestinians, for example. So how are we going to qualify this topic, this concept of detentive coercion, because it could be used in a wide variety of ways. So
yeah, you're absolutely right. It can be used in a lot of different ways. I mean, detention and violence are by themselves not necessarily good. They can be used very cruelly and to control and to dominate. All I'm saying is that there's a vast difference between strategic violence used in a context of a nonviolent movement And Gandhi gave two examples. You say he was not a pure pacifist. He talked about if you came across a sniper, somebody who was on a rooftop and he was shooting at people. Well, you are obligated to stop that person from stopping the violence in process in whatever way you can. I mean, obviously, it'd be great if you could use tear gas or something to non-violently stop him, but if there's nothing else and it ends up in destruction of life, you've stopped the larger violence that was happening. He also gave the example of a rape in process. If you come along and there's some man who has attacked some woman, you have an obligation to get him off and to stop that. And if he fights back and violence often happens in this context. So violence in the context to try to, for the sake of nonviolence, Gandhi would justify. And as I say, he himself gave those examples. And so it's far different between that and a whole strategy of violence in which your efforts are meant to try to coerce and to dominate the other side. And then you may use a little nonviolence as a part of your technique. That doesn't justify the nonviolence, because the whole strategy is a violent one. So context is everything, is what I'm saying.
So I have a question which is related to methods only. So as a student of conflict resolution, I'm raising these questions because I myself am confused. So it relates to Gandhi's method of fasting. And sometimes we come across as this method, this method as something that is coercive. But I think that fasting is something which has implicitly, which is embedded in forcefulness rather than coercion per se. So is there a difference between, coercion and force when we talk about Gandhi's method of fasting? The other associated question is related to sort of misappropriation that is happening with the religious movements, in the religious movements right now. Is that, for instance, Gandhi's method, Gandhi's fast against untouchability, against separate electorates was said to be a call from God. And now we see how, this entire, reason, we can say that it is a call from God, is being appropriated by the terrorist organizations, religious movements as well. So how to, understand this difference between understanding of spirituality, different understandings of spirituality and heroic violence. Gandhi supported heroic violence, as against cowardly non-violence. Now, when we come across this statement that suicide bombing is being, suicide bombers are told that your violence is actually heroic violence. How do we understand, make sense of that? So yeah, these are the questions.
Well, the first part of your question is Gandhi was not always a good Gandhian, as far as I can see. I mean, you can, I'm sure there's disagreement with this and people would think that, oh, how can you possibly say such a thing? But in one section of my little book on Gandhi's way, I have dialogues with Gandhi and Marx and Gandhi and Niebuhr and Gandhi and Freud, and the Mohandas versus the Mahatma, where the real Gandhi and the ideal Gandhi are in conflict. And all these dialogues, by the way, I use their own words. So I've gone back and I've gotten, I've pieced together, words based on their own justification of these points of view. And the ideal Gandhi would never use a coercive forms of nonviolence. That is, ideally, people reach satyagraha when they voluntarily, on their own will, see that it's a good solution. On the other hand, there are a lot of devices to kind of forcefully bring this to their attention. And that's where, a fast or a protest march or non-cooperation movement can be very effective. What you're saying here is in case of non-cooperation, you're not cooperating with anything that is evil or is bad, So you're just going to create an alternative way of doing things and not cooperate. This is, of course, what JP famously did in his movement of total revolution during that period of time. This is before your lifetimes, but it was a critical moment. The only time that president's rule was put into effect in India, and they suspended the legislature because JP's movement really did kind of threaten the powers, because he was saying, look, we can ignore the Indian government. We set up our own form of village governance, and we don't need them. It's a corrupt government, so let's just do our own thing. So that's all within, kind of permissible strategies. But are there moments when he goes over the line? And are these fasts that he undertook not a long period of time, actually, in the case of the fast against separate electorates, one you're talking about. And interestingly, in the Punjab, I interviewed, part of my dissertation was on untouchable religious politics in the Punjab. And I interviewed people who went on a counter fast against Gandhi, to say, well, we feel just as strongly. Is that really coercive, and does that go over the line? And when you're using this as a means of trying to force people into a position, I raise that issue. I don't know. I guess you can find a way of justifying, but it seems to me that there are moments when Gandhi came perilously close to defining his own position. And the other thing you asked about was spirituality. Well, we're always in danger when we claim that God is on our side, and that God commands us to do this or that. I'm reminded of Abraham Lincoln's, American president's, words during the Civil War in the United States, when someone said, "Mr. President, do you think that God is on our side?" And he said, "Well, I don't know, but I certainly hope that we're on God's side." And it seems to me that's the right position. There's something presumptuous and pretentious about thinking that you have the eternal truth, that you and have almost a divine revelation of what the truth is. And I don't think Gandhi had it either. He may have said something to kind of enforce the point that he felt that this was like a spiritual or moral commitment, and use it in a kind of metaphorical way. But it seems to me to use that language is kind of dangerous, because then you're flirting with the notion that you have the pretension of knowing God's mind. And interesting, Gandhi didn't have that idea of God whatsoever. I mean, his notion was God was truth. So his idea was truth is, and reversed it. He said truth is God. He didn't have an anthropomorphic notion of God at all. His idea of religion was really quite different than that of traditional religiosity.
Thank you. I think, Shailaja, you want to ask something?
I had a question. I had two questions. One was that based on the recent farmers movement that you mentioned, that it's one of the largest movements and it was able to sustain. My question was, why was the student movement not able to sustain, which had a similar modus operandi? And because for me, I think the question of resources in both the movements stand paramount. And my second question is just that I've met you for the first time, and I'm an outsider to this group, but it's very interesting that every time you are speaking, you have a very calming sort of an effect. So I wanted to know, how much of a Gandhian are you in your own life? And what is it that you have imbibed in your own personal life? Because it's a bit reflective on the way you are as in your communication right now. And I'm just intrigued to know, as a young student, that how do you imbibe what you've been teaching and learning for so long? And that's it. Thank you.
So thank you. And I'll take that as something of a compliment. I don't know, my wife says I'm not a Gandhi at all, but she means that It means that I don't live on nothing and, and try to, my possessions are much more. You can see by my study behind you, my possessions are much more than simply my glasses and, and a cup of water. So I'm not a Gandhian in that sense, but I certainly have been influenced by Gandhi. He's been one of the, I think through Jayaprakash Narayan, has been one of the great influences on my life. And there have been other influences, but certainly the Gandhian model is profound, not because I think Gandhi was always right. I think he was very much of a human. And yet what impresses me is that he never stopped trying to find out what was right. And the title of his autobiography, Experiments of Truth, really describes the whole of his life of trying to think in moral and social terms about what is right and how to accomplish something that's right collectively, especially surrounded by so many people who disagree with us and so many counter points of view. It seemed to me that he was on a very productive mission that way, and I find that somewhat comforting, especially in today's climate when the divisions seem to be so great and the lines between the divisions so intractable, so difficult to surmount. That there are ways of thinking beyond them, and there are possibilities of thinking beyond them. So I am comforted by Gandhi. Thank you for raising that.
Thank you very much. I think this group is trying to explore the possibility of developing a model based on Gandhian Satyagraha, which could be used at 3 different levels. At a personal level, very personal level, we are seeing that personal conflict is also growing in a big way. So something like logotherapy or something like imagotherapy, if we can also draw upon Gandhi's ideas and develop a model of interpersonal relationship. And second is at a community level, because I think we are heading towards a big problem in India at the moment. The inter-community conflict might grow in years to come. And third is, of course, the international level, the way things are happening in Ukraine, the things are happening in other parts. So if we can develop something based on the suggestions you have given, I think that's very practical suggestion. We could not discuss that, but those 5 stages or steps that you have suggested, how to take others' point of view as seriously, how allow the more moderate viewpoint to come on the surface and negotiate with that. Then how do you kind of resolve certain issues and create a larger framework where we can sit together and engage in a dialogue. So all these things, I think, are very, very important and suggestive. We are also thinking, Mark, that what is needed today is to develop a small workshop kind of thing, which we can take to the students, younger students, children. I think that in the school, actually, there's no training of entering in a dialogue. So what Professor Mohanty calls, we are producing obsessive self and not working on the creative self. I think Gandhian idea of Satyagraha can help us in reclaiming our creative self. So we have these models in mind, and we will be in touch with you, and we will, as you have always helped us, we will be always looking towards you for new ideas, and we will have more occasions to have such dialogues.
Well, good. I'll be interested to see how it goes. Let me just keep in touch.
Sure. Yes. So we'll keep in touch, and we will invite you some other day also to have more rigorous dialogue on this Naxal violence versus Gandhian Satyagraha. And I wish to invite Professor Mohanty in that, and would like to see how 2 of you look at these 2 things together. Thank you very much. Thanks.
But thank you.
Thank
And
you.
good night, everyone.
Vipanchika,
night,
you want to
everyone.
say something finally? Yeah. Or Priya? Yeah.
I I think this has been a very insightful session. Of course, your insights about digital self, conflict resolution, religion, and lastly, spirituality were really refreshing. And this a discussion on these issues, I feel, are really important today, especially because the lines between political and religious violence today are blurring, and we need tools to understand and resolve these conflicts. Although there is a lot more to discuss, as we have reached the end of our session, I would like to conclude it with a word of thanks to our guest speaker, Mark Juergensmear, for accepting our invitation to this dialogue series. I would also like to thank Dr. Manindra Thakur sir for moderating this session and for guiding us throughout. Last but not least, I would thank the entire organizing team for their efforts in putting this session together.
To the viewers, we thank you for watching this intense dialogue. I request you to please post your questions in the comment sections below. Stay tuned for our next session of this dialogue series on the theme Nonviolence and Terrorism in the 21st Century. Subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for further notifications. Thank you.
Thank you very much.